Catch up on all the live shows right here on africatechradio.com.
Floods, famine, drought, locust attack, unbearable heat, climate change. If you have not experienced any of these firsthand, you must have heard of it from somewhere or from someone. The Global Climate Summit, which was held in Egypt, known as COP27, is the conference of the parties, which includes the 197 nations that agreed to a new environmental pact called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change at a meeting in the year 1992. In 2021, the conference aimed to secure global net zero by mid-century and keep 1.5 degrees within reach. It also aimed to adapt to protect communities and natural habitats, mobilize finance, finalize the Paris Rulebook, the detailed rules that make the Paris Agreement operational, and work together to accelerate action to tackle the climate crisis. Now, what were the commitments made at COP26 that concerned Africa, and how well did the implementation go for Africa? That's one. What commitments have been made at COP27, and did these commitments meet the expectation of what we all called or referred to as an African COP? What did the conference aim to achieve in Egypt, and were the goals actually achieved during the negotiations? We're joined by a climate activist and an expert, and a COP27 delegate, Chiagozie Udeh, to discuss these issues. Hi, Chiagozie. How are you doing today?
I'm very well, Antonio. Thanks for having me, and hope you're doing good.
Yeah, I'm good. I'm fine. How did the journey go from the conference back to where you're based, where you're staying?
Well, as you can imagine, for every COP, at the end of the COP, it's usually very tiring, and you almost left completely sapped of energy. So yeah, it was a safe trip for most people back. I think a few illness here and there, the stress of 2 to 3 weeks of intense engagement and negotiations. So yeah, we're all back, recovering as always, but happy to get this done.
And it seemed like the World Cup came just at the heel of it, just when we finished with the negotiations at the COP27.
Yeah, absolutely. So probably good timing to have something to really relax with. Starting just at the end of COP. COP ended early in the morning on the Sunday, and then the World Cup started later in the evening. So probably good for those that were in the last plenary. They probably missed watching the games at the beginning, but I think it's a good getaway from this very, very difficult technical negotiations. Pretty much welcome.
So when you place the expectations that Africans had, we all had before COP27 and after, did COP27 meet our expectations?
So this is in many folds. I would say that people can argue about this from many perspectives, but if you're talking about delivering for Africa, in terms of their needs, in terms of their priority, I would think that developing countries may have something to cheer about the outcome of COP27, particularly because the biggest win from this conference was the Loss and Damage Fund, which has been championed by developing countries, and not excluding Africa. A lot of African activists, governments have really championed this agenda. And for the first time in the COP process, loss and damage was included as an agenda item in the COP. And also, being an agenda item, the discussion progressed quite strongly. Of course, it didn't feel like this during the process of within the 2 weeks of the COP. It felt like this during the ending. It was in the last 72 hours that it felt like something was coming through. So this loss and damage fund was a very significant, very important win for Africa. There were also, in the lead up to the COP, a lot of talks about this COP being a COP of adaptation and resilience, which is primarily what Africa has been, working on around its priority areas for climate action. This COP did not particularly deliver for adaptation finance. The COP26 ensured a lot of pledges a lot of talks about doubling financing for adaptation. A lot of those pledges remained pledges as we speak, and they were not delivered. So there was an air of disappointment in this axis, and countries were frustrated that pledges made in Glasgow were not redeemed, and yet again there was not a significant progress around adaptation. There were negotiations around the global goal on adaptation. There were other little moves of the needle here and there on the topic, but substantially there was not a strong achievement on that front from COP27. So there may be a feeling of disappointment in some quarters around this, but then many would take solace in the fact that this COP delivered a loss and damage, and that was unprecedented.
Now, let's just try to highlight the major negotiations and final agreements that we would say can be tied to COP27.
Okay, so there were quite a lot of broad areas of negotiation. There was, of course, on adaptation, on mitigation, on gender and climate, on loss and damage, on climate finance, which is statutory, and also on carbon markets, the Article 6. So, in all of this, first we've highlighted that a fund for loss and damage has been established. This is significant. This is the first time it's happened in over 30 years since Vanuatu, a small island state, mentioned this in a UN process. This fund, we only have the mere establishment. We have not got into the details, so there's a lot of work needed to be done to really understand how this fund should operate, specifically mention the criteria for access, how it could address the impacts of people and who is contributing what part to which. Because one difficult area that threatened this deal was around which countries are going to contribute to this. Within the UN system, you find that some countries have been developing countries since 1992. They've remained developing country, even though their circumstances have changed. So now a lot of countries are saying that these countries are no longer developing countries. They should be developed countries, but that has not been changed within the UN process. So that means, in fact, that if the fund is thrown open, these countries could be eligible to benefit from the funding. So as part of the negotiations, some of these countries were called out by fellow parties to say that countries like A, B, and C should be able to contribute to the pot of this fund. And obviously, countries would ideally want them to have responsibilities to contribute enormous financing. So it was a part of the negotiations that was a bit contentious until some middle ground was sought. So this was, on the one side, a very important win. The second one was about the mitigation work program. This COP did not deliver strongly on keeping emissions under 1.5 degrees C. In fact, at some point, many people would consider it as almost reneging or struggling to match the level of ambition that Glasgow did on this topic. If you recall, Glasgow called for a face down of fossil fuels, including coal, right? But then this at the COP27, there was even at a point where it was under threat that we cannot even maintain what we had from Glasgow. So the final text around the mitigation work program was not strong enough. It's still managed to really try to maintain what we had from Glasgow, but did not improve on its ambition. It does not ask for stronger pledges. It merely recalled the request from last year in Glasgow. And it also does not call for global emissions to peak as soon as possible and given a deadline of 2025. So these were areas that it did not address. And developed countries, a lot of developed countries, the EU and other negotiating blocs were very disappointed that the mitigation work program was weak in strongly insisting on phasing off all fossil fuels and giving clear guidance that really brings us to 1.5 degrees C. So for many countries, there's a feeling that while we delivered on loss and damage, we're treating the symptoms and not the causes. So they felt like mitigation work program was a major letdown that cannot be accepted. In fact, at some point, a lot of developed countries' delegations threaten not to agree to a deal that includes this loss and damage if the mitigation component is not enhanced. In fact, in the statements made by some of the representatives of these blocs, they repeatedly highlighted that they are reluctantly backing the final decision of the COP27 as not to let down their colleagues from developing countries who's worked incredibly hard to deliver the loss and damage fund. So on this mitigation work program, there's a bit of a letdown, and people feel that this COP could have done better to deliver on this. And then around Article 6 negotiations is negotiations around the carbon markets, about carbon offsets. How can we trade within this mechanism? How is the money used? The transparency, accountability. These are all captured under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. So last year, if you remember, the Glasgow Pact delivered strongly on Article 6. It agreed around this framework. For the first time since the Paris Agreement, we're able to agree on a way forward on Article 6. Now we're getting into the details of how this can really be operationalized. Who is trading what is eligible to be traded? How is it communicated? How are the emissions handled? So one of the contentious issues around this was what information would countries, report in the internationally traded mitigation outcomes, which is the ITMOs, and should this reporting be kept confidential or should it be made public? So parts of the agreed text was leaning towards giving countries, control to keep this information secret, which a lot of actors and stakeholders were not happy with. They felt this is compromising, and also speaks a lot to enhancing or enabling countries to probably engage in some kind of greenwashing. Because if the information is kept confidential and cannot be accessed by everyone, then how do you verify? How do you hold government and companies accountable on their various claims? The SOPSTA is a technical body in science and technology to really develop rules that might constrain the use of this confidentiality clause. So this is an item under development. They've asked the countries and other parties also to submit their views on this matter or by the next midterm meeting, which would be in June, which we call the intersessionals. It's a more technical negotiation that has around 5,000 to 6,000 people. It will happen in Bonn in June 2023, and countries have been asked to submit their views about whether this information should be confidential or not, and the modalities around that. So there could be a decision on this hopefully by the next COP or the subsequent ones. And this would link on, the necessary infrastructure to trade on carbon credits, hopefully through, from what is popularly mentioned, through a centralized accounting and reporting platform. Another sticking point around this Article 6 is about carbon removal. So there are negotiations around, within the climate space, there are concerns from some stakeholders about the concept of carbon removal, using technology, various scientific procedures to remove carbon instead of stopping the emission, right? So many people have proposed this as a solution. A lot of people have also opposed it as abdicating responsibility and probably causing other damage that may not be very useful in the process of addressing climate change. So this process of removal is essentially trying to engineer a process that sucks out carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and it's not sitting very comfortably with a lot of stakeholders. And there are also people who really admire this and are trying it out at large scale. Some countries are already making huge technological advances around this component: carbon capture and storage, carbon removal, all of this. So the negotiations around this were, how do we define the concept of carbon removal? So, how do we really have a supervisory body that can analyze and suggest ways on what can count as carbon removal and what cannot? And how can this process be run efficiently, if at all it can run efficiently? How can it run efficiently? How can it be monitored? How can people be able to hold this process to account? What are the safeguards, especially around the people, impact on the environment? How is it appropriate in terms of human rights considerations? How does it impact indigenous people? How does it impact local communities? Are there, other impacts that are not accounted for now? This is the whole conversation around carbon removal. So this also was one of the major points also that were discussed. But by and large, this COP was a COP that, for the first time mentioned things around the right to a healthy environment. And in its cover decision, it mentioned things around nature-based solutions, mentioned things around food security, water, things like river, water stress and things like this. It's also mentioned the need for our financial systems to really transform, especially giving responsibility to multilateral development banks to really reform their practices to address this emergency. The cover decision also, as you could see, it's launched the Sharm el-Sheikh dialogue on financial flows. This is around Article 2.1c, that the financial flows that should really be aligned towards addressing the global temperature targets of 1.5 degrees C. And it also launched a work program on just transition. This is absolutely important, not just for transitioning of workers from the fossil fuel sector to the green job sector, but also transitioning of local communities from current practices to sustainable ones. So it was also one of the important components that emerged from the cover decision of the COP. There were also negotiations around the gender. A lot of stakeholders wanted stronger language that really highlights the importance of centering gender components at the heart of climate action. A lot of work needs to be done on this. My sense is that a lot of stakeholders left with it not being impressed with the negotiations around gender and climate. And a lot of work needs to be done for the next round of negotiations to really strengthen this, especially the human rights component. So I probably will stop here and if you have questions then.
So even before the COP27 itself started, the main event started, some countries had already started making announcements. We started hearing monies. So with what you have just said, considering the fact that, the fund has been announced and it has been established, but we're not really sure exactly who would be getting it, what will be triggering such fund, who will be contributing to such fund. Should we be excited, that at least the fund has been announced and it's been approved and it's been established, or will it still take a long time for it to be operationalized?
I would say cautious excitement. First, because this conversation has been on for 30 years. It has never been on the COP agenda. Every time it's remained a taboo topic for this space. I remember once discussing with some high-level official within the intergovernmental space, and the conversation was and this official was telling me that we should change the coin of loss and damage. Instead of using words like loss and damage, we should use words like I think it was risk and opportunities or something like this. And I remember saying that the problem was not in the nomenclature of this negotiation item that is being proposed. It's about the commitment of parties to deliver on them. So what has changed the game, I suppose, is the impact of climate change that is expanding, not just in the most vulnerable countries, but also in Europe and in America. For example, the last year floods in parts of Europe, in Germany, in Switzerland, and other places, really devastated communities that those countries had to pay these communities loss and damage fund. So after paying this loss and damage fund, it is probably my suspicion that then it was easier to listen to this conversation because the impact will arrive there with their communities. They could see it and then they could believe it. We also must not underestimate the important role that countries like Pakistan played in really driving this agenda forward. Having experienced intense floods this year, it was very, very impressive to see the leadership of Pakistan, of the G77 and China, a negotiating group within the space, that really worked so hard with other blocs like the AOCs, the Alliance of Small Island States, to push as hard as possible to deliver on this loss and damage fund. Yes, we only have the fund there. We don't have the details. We don't know where the money is coming from. There are already commitments to this fund, from countries who donated willingly. But it's of course not enough. It's just a good indication that countries are looking to commit. But what is required is going to be enormous. it may take time before we really have this fund operationalized. First of all, it's going to have a secretariat. Who is going to host the secretariat? We don't know. We will know about which country is hosting the secretariat in the coming weeks. After the secretariat is established, we have to have conversations with the UNFCCC secretariat on how to really operationalize. There will be an advisory group that advises on how this should be set up, what are the components, who can access, how can this fund be rapidly disbursed, because we're talking about addressing impact, post-climate disaster impact. Mitigation takes care of causes, adaptation takes care of just before the impact and during the impact. But then loss and damage is about what happens after the impact. So this fund needs to be disbursed immediately and also in anticipation. It needs to have a special mechanism that makes it flexible to really address the challenges of people as quickly as possible. So it's going to take some time. I don't want to put a time frame on it, but I will not be expecting that it will happen today or tomorrow. It could take a few years to really set up this fund, determine the whole modus operandi of how it runs, and then begin disbursement. And of course, there will be things about accreditation, who is eligible to access, what manner of metrics do you use to gauge which countries are eligible and which countries are not, and which countries are going to contribute to this pot, right? A lot of fingers are pointed at China that they must contribute. While China is officially a developing country within the framework, some countries feel that their circumstances have changed strongly and they should no longer be classified as a developing country. So these dynamics will also develop in terms of who should be contributing to this fund. But at least we have it established. We can have these conversations then in the next cycles of negotiations, both in the one in June and in the one that will happen next year in UAE, in November, December.
Not to put you on the spot, but if you would, determine if it's, for you to determine who should contribute and who should be eligible to benefit from the funds, how would you classify the countries that should contribute and the countries that should be eligible for the loss and damage fund?
Well, currently, what we have from the negotiations is that it's looking for countries that will benefit from this fund to be countries that are most vulnerable to climate impact. So it's tried to shrink the number of eligible countries that can access this fund. While there was a lot of appetite to push for the access to be open for a wide range of countries, largely developing countries, to be able to access. But then the fear from the funders is that will open a large chunk of access issues for a lot of countries to then be eligible to access this fund, which means that the contributions they may be able to get will not be enough to go around. So it's looking to be narrowed to most vulnerable, particularly vulnerable countries to be able to access this fund. I think in my own understanding or opinion, I would say that countries, especially countries of the global south, who obviously face this challenge, should be eligible to access this funding. There could be determinations around what qualifies to, the details of who qualifies to access. But at least if it's open to everybody to access, we can then get into the details of what kind of situation qualifies as loss and damage situation, what kind of situation does not qualify, so that you make sure that countries are not abusing that process to then have everything funded through the loss and damage fund.
And who should contribute?
Well, obviously, I think that developed countries have the responsibility to contribute to this, as it's in the process of the UN climate change. They traditionally have been the ones with the responsibility to contribute as much, owing to the enormous emissions that they've contributed as well, which are part of the causes of this impact. So if the emissions were not there at the beginning, we may not have a situation of loss and damage. So the biggest emitters have a responsibility to contribute, regardless, I think, of their status within the UN frameworks, whether they are Annex 1 or Annex 2 countries.
Okay, now the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, unveiled a $3.1 billion plan to ensure everyone on the planet is protected by early warning systems in the next 5 years. And according to the UN still, only 40% of African population have access to early warning systems against extreme weather and climate change impacts. It seems like we are turning to technology for mitigation. What are your thoughts about this as it concerns African countries and how we're looking to technology. And then for those countries who do not exactly have these technologies, how long do you think it will take to set up this fund and to get the access to these monies? I just hope that these persons do not, I don't want to use the word like die, but I just hope that they're not really affected before the next 5 years when the early warning systems, actually goes global, like everyone can actually be covered by it. So what are your thoughts about this?
Well, thank you for asking. I think this one, the early warning system is absolutely vital, not just for Africa, but for every country, right? It's an important solution to climate impact. For example, in Nigeria this year, we've had over 600 people die from flooding. This death could be prevented with precise, more targeted early warning systems. I know there were warnings, also there were a bit of exchanges between the federal and state government on who acted and who did not. But early warning systems are absolutely vital in the most vulnerable places to be able to inform the local communities, the government, that this is going to happen at this time. As part of your adaptation strategy, this is what you're expected to do, and this is how we can assist you. It helps you to plan. It helps you to have data on where will be the most impact, what will be the scale of impact, what are the response measures needed, what are the anticipatory actions needed. It enhances early planning. It reduces risk. It reduces vulnerability of the most affected people and areas. So it helps you at least to move a population away from an area of danger into a higher place where they can stay in the immediate. It helps you to then plan how will people that will be impacted in this area access education, access sexual reproductive health and rights services, access, more multiple vital daily needs within this period until they're able to be resettled. It helps you ensure that girls' education is not scuttled. So it's an absolutely important strategy, not for mitigation. It's actually more for adaptation and resilience building. The early warning systems are more for adaptation, resilience building, and even being able to channel loss and damage finance if there is one. So it's absolutely important. This is already ongoing. Obviously, there's a shortfall in this. We need to do this in more and more countries that also incorporate vulnerability assessment to have data that are disaggregated by gender, by age, in multiple forms, really, really heavily disaggregated data that you can know who is impacted where, what is their sex, how are you going to have a targeted response for each demographic. It's absolutely an important thing that I'm really glad and thank the Secretary General for being able to highlight this and be very vocal in driving this conversation around climate change. Secretary General has also been immensely vocal in driving the conversation around loss and damage. And I think all stakeholders, especially those from the most vulnerable places, find in him an important and incredible ally that really amplifies their voices across this issue. So I think it's an absolutely welcome development. It will take time to come in many countries, but we need to go as fast as we can to deliver it in the most affected places so we can at least stop the loss of lives. For me, climate action must first of all stop people from dying. Then you can talk about every other thing, but people must stop dying, and then we can take care of the rest. If we keep losing people, then we're not achieving anything.
Very, very important. If we keep losing people, we are not achieving it, because what exactly is the aim of it? If not, to save life and ensure that life is better for the human beings here on Earth. Now, as many countries either go to the poll on the continent or just witnessed, a new government or election, it doesn't exactly look like climate change issues are the front burner, like the major issues being discussed. Kenya, for example, just had their election, and we know Kenya has suffered from one of the most intense droughts and climate change extremities. Nigeria will be going to polls in 2023, early 2023, and it doesn't still look like climate change is one of the major issues that are being discussed every day when matters of national development and politics are being talked about. What can we do to put climate change issues and matters at the center of national politics and discourse?
I think in developing countries such as the ones you've listed, it's a big challenge, because in these places there's multiple issues. There are issues about out-of-school children. There's issues about water and sanitation access. There's issue of economic inflation, unemployment, insecurity, kidnapping, criminal activities here and there. There's incredible poverty. There's a lot of issues that require our attention as well. There's health issues. You don't have primary healthcare systems. So there's many issues. And also there is the lack of literacy around climate change and climate discussions that really prevent it from being put on the front burner of the agenda as it should by the people. When you go to local communities where climate change impacts are most intense and most visible, how many of them have the education to even understand that this is climate change? How many of them make the linkage of their realities, their daily realities, to climate impacts? Even how does the government policies connect to this? In most of these countries, what I see clear climate impacts linkage to insecurity, gender inequality, child marriage, gender-based violence, and all of these issues. Climate is exacerbating them. But then how is it captured in the policy? There's often not a connection to the policy response. And then you find that even how the media picks it up, it's significantly different, right? For example, in Nigeria, as of 2018, I was already writing articles in the national newspaper about the impact of climate change on our national security, especially within the northern part of the country. This impact has continued to grow. But how is the government articulating the response in its climate plan, but also in its security plan, right? So that articulation needs to happen. Then it is transferred to the people's awareness. The media picks it up, and then it can become a core agenda for election. For example, in Europe, there's no problem about putting climate on the agenda. It is on the ballot. If you're not going to address it in many countries, you're losing election. It's on the ballot. It should be even more on the ballot in developing countries because the impacts are enormous. But there's less literacy in trying to make the connection. And that is where I find the challenge that we must address.
Any ideas on how we can go about, addressing it?
I think obviously there's a lot of climate education that needs to happen. There's a lot of capacity building that needs to happen also for people that work in public institutions, government institutions, or the public institutions. At the primary, secondary, tertiary education level, climate education needs to be enhanced. The people should be aware of what impact they are facing. The farmer that is complaining of reduced yield needs to know why the crops are not doing well, why there's disruption in rain patterns, why he needs to use enhanced crop to adapt to different situations. If they are planting in a drought area or drought-prone area, they can use drought-resistant seedlings. This kind of education needs to happen for people to be able to understand. So education is absolutely important. Capacity building of people who serve the public needs to happen so they can be able to then, in planning, in making national policies, in making national plans, be able to articulate this very organically without any hesitations.
Now, it seems that young people were in the spotlight in this COP in Egypt. I heard that a pavilion was devoted to children and youth, and it was for the first time. We know that the younger generations will suffer the most from the climate crisis we currently feel. What's your take on how important it is for developing countries in Africa to ensure that the younger generation are not just educated, have the education, understand what it is, but also are given the tools and prepared to deal with the crisis that is ahead?
I think young people in Africa and all over the world have shown incredible leadership. I think they've shown what they can do. They've shown beyond their voices, their competence. And I think for so many years, we've fought for more youth spaces within this process. We fought for these spaces for young people from the global south. We've seen that space expand and increase. And I look back from years past, for example, when we were at COP22 in Marrakesh in 2016, it was a very lean space. There were limited global south engagements. But now we have a lot of young people from the global south who are able to access the spaces, who are part of their negotiating team, who are making incredible changes. It's still not enough. We need more young people on the negotiating table to influence directly the outcomes of the negotiations. We need more young people in decision-making spaces to be ministers in their countries, to be MPs, to be able to facilitate organically important decisions that are climate friendly. in their countries. We need to trust young people because they've shown the competence and they've shown the capacity to deliver. In fact, of course, I've worked. I've also been a leader of the youth constituency within this space, and I know how incredibly competent many of my colleagues are, and how they can really deliver for their country if truly given that responsibility. So I think the young people have demonstrated enormous will, enormous commitment, enormous knowledge and competence to deliver, and their countries should, especially those in Africa, should trust them to deliver on this agenda item and to advance it. Their generation, or this generation of young people, are the ones that will face the most impact, but also they will be in between success of this agenda or failure, and they must be involved in the implementation of these decisions. We have the Youth Pavilion, which was great. It was an incredible space for young people to gather. But there was already a youth process within the climate negotiations. There's a youth constituency that has been there for over a decade and has been facilitating meaningful youth engagement within the space, getting into negotiations also through multiple means. But this must be enhanced, and countries must enhance the number of young people that are negotiated in very critical items for them. Climate finance, adaptation, loss and damage, and also not just that, but also in the implementation. They must be part of the implementation of this agenda items. So I think we will benefit a lot if young people are more mainstreamed across the implementation side.
And now, what is next for Africa after COP27? Next steps, next things to do?
Well, we don't have the financing to do what we want to do. Adaptation finance is 5 to 10 times lower than what is required for this continent, and it's important that it delivers for the people and for the planet. So we need to keep pushing for an actual doubling of adaptation finance, right? To have it delivered on the table beyond pledges, to have the finance in the bank. This is important. It's also important that African countries are able to develop national adaptation plans that really showcase their long-term plan on how they want to adapt to the impact of climate change and what sectors they are focusing on, and how these multiple sectors are coming together to address this multiple impact. This is absolutely important for the African continent. And again, of course, we need to keep pushing in the international scene. The Loss and Damage Fund is established, but we need to discuss the details. We need to keep pushing as hard as we can to really implement this commitment. We need to push developed countries to implement their own commitment, because if they implement their own commitment, their NDC commitment, their net zero commitment, we will actually have a reduced emissions target. Emission reduction will then begin to happen, and then we can begin to feel the less impact in maybe 3 decades time. So we need to hold ourselves accountable, but also hold others accountable to be able to hear the desire of relief.
Okay, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us. Any final thoughts as to what transpired at COP27 and what we should be expecting as we look forward to the next COP and then the technical negotiations that would happen in June 2023?
Well, I think it's great to have the COP27. Congratulations to Egypt for hosting. There were a lot of positive sides. There were also some other sides that could be improved. For COP28, everybody's looking forward to that, knowing the UAE, they are really ambitious and likes to deliver really outstanding things. So let's see how that goes. There's a lot of optimism around that. There's some conversations that maybe it will be technology heavy, but we will see how this goes. And we have to be optimistic that UAE will really deliver in terms of implementation, but also in raising ambition. And then that we can have technical negotiations in between that will bring us to a very good place ahead of the COP28. So I call on everybody, my fellow stakeholders, government, countries, everybody in every space, to work hands in gloves together, stronger, united in one vision, ambition, and delivery of our commitments is absolutely important. We need to hold our governments accountable in all spheres, so that we don't come every year to make pledges, but actually make pledges that we will implement. This is absolutely important. Implementation is the key. And where does the implementation happen? At a national level. And this is important for everybody to keep an eye on.
Thank you very much. While the Glasgow Climate Pact is the first ever climate deal to explicitly plan to reduce coal, phase down, COP27 brought about the establishment of a loss and damage fund. So yes, we have a loss and damage fund, just like Chiagozie, who I'm speaking to now, hammered on this time last year, immediately after COP26. And yes, he says cautious excitement. But the decision on loss and damage, the fund, won't fix our climate change issues, and it won't fix it immediately, because the fund comes with many unknowns, like what the criteria will be to trigger a payout, where the money will come from, who will benefit from the fund, will the funds even be enough to address all the issues. As we plan towards COP28, we all need to know that efforts are still not anywhere strong enough, and we must all up our game to mitigate and adapt to climate change. Thank you, Chiagozie, for speaking to us today. Thank you for sharing your thoughts too with me.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your week.
Yeah, but before I let you go, Chiagozie, who do you tip to win the World Cup in Qatar?
Oh, probably not a good day to ask this question after what Saudi did yesterday, but I still remain confident.
You sound like a Messi fan.
I am an absolute Messi fan, so
okay.
I can't hide that. Yeah, so I hope that Argentina comes back to win it. But I'll be cheering for Switzerland until they get knocked out.
Okay, you sound very sure that they will get knocked out.
Well, we will see. I have that expectation of where they can get to, but we will see. Never know.
Okay. And towards the elections in Nigeria in 2023, I'm not asking you who you think would win, but if you have 3 issues you think should be at the front, like the major issues every contender should have a plan towards solving, what 3 issues would you propose?
I know we have at least 133 million people in multidimensional poverty. That is a clear priority for anyone that wants to run the government of the country. When you have more than half of your population in multidimensional poverty, it is not something to smile about. It is a total crisis and must be addressed. So that is an immediate priority. Obviously, electricity is an issue for the country. It's been an issue for many years. That should be addressed. It should be an obvious priority for the country to address this energy crisis. And of course, insecurity it's been a major issue in the last decade for this country. It's even increasing multiple folds, it's spreading across the country in many ways. This is an important area to tackle as well. I think a safe country would do a lot of good to all the other sectors of development that needs to be addressed. I think a lot of things need work. You cannot really choose, but it's important to highlight these areas.
Thank you very much for your thoughts. And would you be back in Nigeria for the elections? Would you be voting?
I'm not very sure about that, but we will see.
Okay, but you'll be encouraging people who are in Nigeria to do so.
Absolutely. Everyone should be able to exercise their franchise. That should be important.
And this brings up the issue of, like voting from diaspora voting, that this has been an issue in Nigeria for a lot of years. But would you be glad if, excited if, diaspora voting started in Nigerian elections?
Of course, that everybody looks forward to that. And it's not helpful to exclude a large chunk of the population who are living abroad from contributing to that process, which is also part of their rights. So hopefully this will be addressed going forward.
Thank you very much. I won't want to hold you any much longer. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks for listening, and don't forget to catch up on all the live shows right here on africatechradio.com.